Tonight, we have Dominic Etzold. He's going to be presenting Reaping the Whirlwind, the U-boat war off North America during World War I. And Dominic's book made it to Book Authority's Best New World War I books and Best World War I books of all time. That's pretty impressive, Dominic. So I'm going to let you share your screen and take over.
All right, let me get my screen going here. Everybody see that so far?
You can see it, yep.
Okay. Well, my name is Dominic. Thank you for having me. Thank you to John Barrows also, who led me to this organization if he's on here. I'm sorry that I look like I'm in a submarine here, but if anybody's read the book, I'm sitting at the small computer desk that I wrote it, and it's not very accommodating, but I hope you can see me, I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see my screen here. All right, well, today I'm going to be talking about the U-boat war off North America, but specifically the events that happened off New Jersey. I'm going to cover U-151's attack, which was a major attack off New Jersey. That's one of the most well-documented cases. But also I'm going to be touching on some myths, mainly what occurred when U-117 came to the shores of New Jersey, and a rumor about shelling Sandy Hook. That event actually was one of the major catalysts for getting me to write the book in the first place. And it's pretty well known, and it seems to be still told. So I'd like to set the record straight tonight. But before I get into that, first have to talk a little bit about the war in Europe leading up to 1917. I'm not going to go very deep into it because I'm sure most of you are aware, but the United States didn't enter World War I until 1917. It did have a little bit to do with the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which we'll get into a little bit, but there were a lot of other stuff I'm not going to really touch on. It's important to understand where Germany was at this point. The British controlled the seas. The British had a blockade of Germany, which prevented them from getting food, raw materials, mail, even their own citizens back. If you were in the United States, which was neutral, and you were German and you wanted to get home, the British were stopping your shift and imprisoning you because they didn't want you joining the war effort. So Germany, by 1917, if you look at the chart below, was basically getting nothing from the United States. And that the United States was one of Germany's biggest partners, especially for raw materials. This is important to bear in mind, the mentality of the Germans when they did come here. Their goals compared to what the United States was actually experiencing were a little bit different, and we'll touch on that. So, the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917. Again, it had somewhat to do with the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that U-boats could sink vessels without any warning. It didn't matter if they were armed. It didn't matter if they were commercial. It didn't matter if they were passenger. Anything that they saw, they could sink without having any warning. And this included hospital ships, which the Germans considered to be viable targets. Prior to unrestricted submarine warfare, the Germans operated under what was called prize rules, which meant that if a submarine was going to attack a vessel, and if it was not a warship, they had to surface, send a warning shot, so have a ship come over with the papers, and if they were going to sink it, have everybody come off of it to make sure that nobody was killed. This ended when the British began arming merchant ships and when they began sending out what were called Q ships, which were basically warships disguised as tramp steamers that gave all the impressions of being just a freighter or a fishing boat. And when the U-boat surfaced, they would drop their disguise and then shooting at them. That's one of the main reasons the Germans abandoned the prize rules and began just sinking everything. Before the United States entered the war, we had a German submarine freighter, the U Deutschland, come over. That went to Baltimore. It came back again later on for a second trip. And also the war submarine U-53, which basically arrived as a scare tactic. It was specially outfitted to come here. It went to Newport, Rhode Island, to the naval base there to basically show face and say, look, we can get here. It took a lot of effort to do, but it did have the effect of scaring the Navy here to the point where he started upgrading things. and it sunk a bunch of a passenger ship and some freighters in international waters, with the United States destroyers just basically sitting there observing it and picking up survivors because they couldn't do anything being a neutral in neutral waters, international waters. Before the United States entered the war, we sent over Admiral William Sodom Sims. He learned from the British basically how desperate their situation was, and he was a bit of an Anglophile. He was really in awe of the British culture, the Royal Navy, and according to him, he wanted all the best destroyers we had, all the best men, all the best battleships to be sent over Europe to fight the war in Europe. The CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations, Benson, he sort of disagreed with this, but ultimately everybody went along with Sims. And as a result, coastal defense here was left to reservists, college students, and antiquated destroyers from the 19th century, along with small 110-foot wooden sub-chasers purposely built for coastal defense. We did send some over to Europe. All in all, about over 300 served in the war, but most of them were along our shores. Likewise, Germany had developed U-cruiser submarines for long-range operations. Part of these were converted merchant ships like the U Deutschland. There were 7 of those, and once war was declared, they didn't have any need to trade with the United States, so they converted them all for combat operations, including the U Deutschland, which became U-155. There was a U-139 class specific U-cruiser, and then U-117 class, which were long-range ocean-going mine layers. And that we're going to talk about specifically the U-151 class and the U-117 class today. This is just a picture of the U Deutschland when it arrived in Baltimore. You can see there's no guns on it, no torpedo tubes. And this was an American postcard celebrating the arrival of the U Deutschland. It was a major event here, and it showed Germany in a really positive light. That changed shortly thereafter. This is U-53 in Newport, Rhode Island. The naval crews at the base, most of which were destroyer crews, were able to come aboard, tour the submarine. Their wives, their children were. They kept suites available for them. They were playing records, and they really overemphasized how great the submarine was, and it wasn't, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. These are, on the left, you have the U Deutschland converted as a warship. On the bottom, you have U-151. They're both the same type, essentially. There are minor differences, which I'm not going to get into tonight. On the top right, you have U-117, which is the mine layer. And on the bottom right, you have U-139, which is a specific U-cruiser. In that, specifically to that one, it was manned by Captain Lieutenant von Arnaud de la Perrière, which was, although he has a French-sounding name, was the highest U-boat ace ever to this day. He operated in the Mediterranean primarily. So, how was New Jersey prepared in the lead up to the declaration of war? We have Fort Hancock on Sandy Hook. It was antiquated, but there were still a lot of formidable guns there. Not so much larger guns from the 19th century, but smaller ones that would have been especially effective against submarines. Thomas Edison, he had been involved in research, hydrophones, subdetection, weapons. He was involved up and down the coast. A lot of his research took place on the Section Patrol Boat 92, the USS Sachem. Unfortunately, the Navy didn't accept any of his inventions, but that doesn't mean that there weren't similar things already in place. The sub-chasers were equipped with 3 different types of hydrophones to triangulate U-boat locations when they were submerged. Executive Order 2584 by Woodrow Wilson closed up harbors to foreign vessels between dusk and dawn. You could get in, you needed special authorization and an escort to do so. There was also a steel wire anti-submarine net constructed to stretch from Sandy Hook to the Ambrose Channel, only to be used at night because they believed that seaplanes and sub-chasers would do a good enough job patrolling during the day. This was never actually tested. None of the vessels made it all the way into New York Harbor. They sunk a lot of stuff outside of it, but never actually got to test the net. And then finally, New Jersey, we built most of the sub-chasers that I was talking about before, both before the United States entered the war and after. Elco, the electric launch company in Bayonne, was originally building what were called ML boats, which were sort of 80-foot sub-chasers for the British Royal Navy. And once we entered the war, they developed the 110-foot sub-chasers. And also the engines were Standard Motors, which was also based in New Jersey. So theoretically, we were a little bit better than the British were at the outbreak of war if you took away the strength of their surface fleet. This is a section patrol boat. This is specifically the one that Thomas Edison was on. Section patrol boats came in all shapes and sizes. They were converted yachts. They weren't a standard vessel. If you had a big yacht, you could actually lease it to the Navy, and a lot of people did. So they were armed depending on the size of the boat. Some of them were more effective than others, but they were not all the same. This one looks like it has 4 deck guns and a Y gun in the back for depth charges. That's a lot. Most of them were a lot smaller and were not like that. This is the 110-foot sub chaser. This was a standard construction. Also had a Y gun in the back for depth charges. They could be launched from the deck, and a deck gun and some machine guns. And then this is just one of the destroyers that would have been here. To put this in perspective, a sub chaser, 110-foot sub chaser, was about a third of the size of this. On the top left here, you have the primary arms of the U cruisers, which was a 15-centimeter or a 6-inch deck gun. This could shoot almost 9 miles. And on the bottom right, you can see basically what most of the sub chasers and destroyers were equipped with: a 3-inch 23 caliber. That 23 caliber doesn't mean 23 caliber like a 22 caliber or 45 caliber. That has to do with the barrel, the length of the barrel. All you do is take the inches and multiply it by the 23, and then you come up with 69. That's how you come up with that. It's naval stuff does it a little bit differently. And these can only shoot 5 miles. So this was quite a bit of a disparity in arms, especially considering that these U-boats primarily use their deck guns for attack. Here we have a picture of U-117 after the war, and in the back is another one of the sub chasers. When I've done presentations in the past, I've shown this one to show the difference in size, but also to ask people what they view the sub chasers as. Because if you bring yourself back to the early 20th century, there were still a lot of sailing vessels. A lot of people, a lot of fishermen hadn't seen submarines at all, or sort of steel hulled vessels. Now I can't ask that now, but I'll show this, which is one of the U cruisers, which are smaller UB submarines. And the answer is that sub chasers really looked a lot like smaller submarines. And off New Jersey in 1918, one of them was actually sunk by a freighter because it thought it saw a surface submarine, and it killed 23 people on board by firing its deck guns. It had no idea. So, with all this in mind, the U cruisers didn't actually depart Germany until a bit later, until 1918, the summer of 1918. They went to North Africa and Africa first to test their engines, to test the length of their trips, to make sure they could do it. That occurred in 1917 after the U.S. entered the war. But they didn't come here until the summer of 1918. In Africa, they proved themselves to be quite formidable. They were slow, but especially with their deck guns, they were able to sink quite a bit. However, Admiral Sims radioed the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, that these should not be feared at all. Under no conditions should any destroyers already in Europe be sent back to the United States for coastal defense, because they've only sunk 30 to 40,000 tons in the patrols. And if they do come here and sink vessels, that it just has to be accepted that we're just going to have to deal with it. We're not changing our policy in Europe. This was debated after the war for a bit, but not enough. I think it still should be debated a little bit more, especially considering World War II. But for the time being, nothing came back. They did say that although we're not going to set a war footing, we're going to leave it up to station commanders to do whatever they want. So in this case, the 4th and 5th Naval Districts in Philadelphia and Norfolk, Virginia, they at least prepped their sub chasers and minesweepers to respond, but nobody wanted to be the first one to make offensive operations. They were sort of instructed to just ignore things. They could act if they wanted to, but nobody wanted to take that leap. And that had some pretty bad effects when U-151 came. Here we see the same picture from before, and this is the commander. von Knossos und Jankendorf. U-151 had orders to set a course for Chesapeake Bay and lay down some minefields. It was equipped with what were called TECA mines, which stood for torpedo caliber, shortened it. And these could be either fired through torpedo tubes, they're a bit smaller, or launched from the deck. U-151 did both of those. And although its presence was given away because it tried to attack two vessels, even though it was explicitly told not to, the warnings were basically ignored. By the time U-151 got here and they tuned into American stations, all they kept hearing were no submarine, no war warning. And this went on even after they had sunk some ships. The first vessel they saw was actually the Huntress and then the Port Said. And just for reference here, on the bottom is the Port Said. And on the left is a cruise ship that I took a photo of using an actual U-boat deck gun deck site that I own. I'm sorry. This was at Sandy Hook right before a nor'easter, so conditions weren't great. But being that that's 5 miles out, the Port Said would probably look about the same size through the deck gun. So this was a very, very good deck gun, a very good telescopic sight, and had a very clear picture. They could hit a lot of stuff with this. This is a quote that's important to remember here. I know you could read it, but I'll read it anyway. It is most important that the public and ships be not falsely alarmed, nor that a state of mind be aroused which would produce a situation more dangerous in the presence of submarines themselves. It is also to the advantage of the enemy that many and false warnings be disseminated for the purpose of confusing and holding back the natural flow of ships. To prevent this, the promiscuous broadcasting by district commanders of warnings, verified or unverified, will cease. And that was the preface to the message to not establish a war warning, but stations could also act independently if they wanted to. So before U-151 made it to Jersey, it laid a mine in Chesapeake Bay. It sunk 3 schooners and took the men on board so that they couldn't get to shore and warn that the submarine was actually here. It then took them up to the Delaware Bay where it laid another minefield. And then U-151 actually cut telegraph cables off of Asbury Park, 3 of them, to communicate with the Caribbean. While they were doing this, U-151 traveled a lot on the surface, obviously at a distance, and they saw a lot of the sub chasers. And because they had crews on board from the sunk vessels, von Knossos specifically asked, "What are those kite boats that he saw?" And he was advised, "Well, those are the sub chasers that were supposed to be patrolling the shore." Obviously, they didn't spot U-151 or made any offensive operation. This would be a problem throughout the war. But by June 22nd, U-151 came back to New Jersey, and we're going to look at what most of the vessels actually looked like during this period. So on June 2nd, the day that we know as Black Sunday now, off of Atlantic City at 6:20, U-151 came across the Isabel B. Wiley, pictured to the top right, and the Winnacone on the bottom right. The Winnacone had a cargo of coal. All these vessels were warned to stop and were boarded and then sunk. Now, I mentioned before that the practice at this point was unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that they could legally just be attacked without any warning. But the Germans that came to North America didn't do this practice. I think there's a few reasons why they didn't do it, but they still observed prize rules. They still wanted to preserve as much life as they could. So in this case, they surfaced, they fired a warning shot. With both these vessels, they thought it was actually an American surface vessel having fun with them, so they were hesitant to stop. But once they did, they realized they were Germans. The Germans came on. They basically said, "Everybody get off, we're sinking the vessel." And then they put what were called Sprengpatronen, which were bombs, and then sunk them. In this initial case, there were so many targets that U-151 actually left its prize crew with a boat and said, "Meet us back later after you sink this," and they did. At 11:25, U-151 stopped at Jacob M. Haskell. That was also bringing coal from Norfolk, Virginia to Boston. And this is an interesting quote from one of the survivors that said, "The men went about their work in a businesslike manner. The officer was so polite that he almost got on our nerves. Each seaman was armed with 2 automatic revolvers and a long, vicious-looking knife." This was something that survivors would say a lot. that the Germans were extremely polite. They were extremely courteous. They wanted to make sure that the survivors could make it home most of the time. And what they refer to as two automatic revolvers and a long, vicious-looking knife were not revolvers. This is another thing we see from survivor testimony, again, because people really weren't familiar with automatic weapons at this time. It was usually one naval Luger, usually a sail knife or a bayonet, but it was a Luger. It wasn't actually a revolver. The Edward H. Cole, another almost 3 hours later, was sunk in the exact same manner. And again, they thought it was the U.S. Navy having fun with them, and not actually Germans intending to sink them. And then finally, around 4:20, U-151 spots the Texel. This was a big steamship, well, big for the time, carrying sugar from Puerto Rico to New York. Once again, her captain ignored the warning shots. He did at this point realize that it was a German ship or a German submarine and sped away and zigzagged. But once the shell started actually reaching the deck, he stopped. The captain justified stopping, claiming that he saw another U-boat. I don't actually believe that, because he was also very critical of U.S. Navy instructions about how to zigzag, basically saying, I did it, it didn't work. And I think he was just making an excuse for himself. Not that there was any shame in stopping, but he seemed to have felt so. After this sinking, U-151 intercepted a message that survivors were being picked up from one of the earlier vessels, and then proceeded submerged along the coast so it wouldn't be spotted. These pictures on the right, you can see the prize crew, in this case U-151's prize officer, Friedrich Korner. On the top left, you see another one of the 15-centimeter guns. On the bottom left, those were the time-fused bombs that actually were placed on vessels. The United States Navy has one of those because some of them didn't explode and they wound up finding the wreck of the ship and confiscated it. And this is another example of a prize crew, this being from the SMS Wolf, a cruiser raider in the Indian Ocean. You can see the guy right here. He has a naval Luger magazines here. There are his knives, and the Luger's right behind it. In this case, you see some Japanese civilians. Again, these people were taken on board and treated with extreme courtesy, because they still consider themselves to be gentlemen at war. And then the last sinking on Black Sunday was when U-151 surfaced and found the Carolina. This was a passenger steamship that went between Puerto Rico and the United States. It was 5,093 tons, 200 passengers on board, and also carried sugar. The captain ignored warnings. He knew this was a German. He seemed to be a little bit more familiar with it, and turned away zigzagging. It also began sending distress signals, of which U-151 jammed with their own signals, and they said they picked up a very faint transmission, just enough that they could barely hear it, which meant that other stations near the coast wouldn't pick it up, saying, if you don't wireless, we don't shoot. And they did continue wirelessing, and then another warning shot had to finally put that to rest. But this is what the people on the Carolina would have seen. This is another U cruiser. This is actually off of Spain, but it basically looks exactly like U-151 would have. In this case, the vessel wasn't sunk, it was boarded, but let go. But if you were on the Carolina in 1918 and you went to the deck, this is what you would have been presented with, which is pretty scary. So scary and so prevalent were rumors about how the Germans behaved that people on board the Carolina, although the submarine was stopped, it was no longer firing, and advised people to take to the lifeboats, they began panicking. Lifeboat number 5 dropped in the water too hastily. Its passengers fell out. People got injured, jumping out, hitting the deck, hitting their heads on other lifeboats. And oddly enough, when the captain's liner actually left the vessel, he claimed he was last man on the ship. So it was ready to be sunk. A German boarding party was still on there looking for things to take, mainly food and maps. They found that Stoker actually was still hiding inside. That's somebody that would operate the boilers, and ordered him to return to one of the lifeboats to pick him up. So here the Germans are on top of the vessel. They have the Stoker, and they're waving a lifeboat to come back to pick up this guy. But due to the propaganda of the period, the passengers felt that the Germans were calling over the lifeboats that they could machine gun basically all the survivors and then leave no trace. Obviously, this wasn't true. They eventually understood their intentions and he was picked up. And because of the size of the vessel and because he heard U-151 picked up radio signals from the warships, they figured they would use a torpedo. Unfortunately, it was a dud. It sunk right to the bottom, and they wound up firing their deck guns. It took eight shots to actually sink the vessel. Again, this is a 15-centimeter deck gun. You saw how big it was. It didn't take much. And although the Germans tried to make sure as many people as they could survived, there were the first casualties here when one of the lifeboats overturned in bad weather. And I mentioned here Elena Donata Virola, one of the passengers from the capsized lifeboat, survived. She didn't have a life jacket on, but her fiance did, and her fiance wound up dying, and she clung to his dead body until she was picked up nearly 10 hours later. By July, U-151 made it back to Germany. She traveled a total of 11,000 nautical miles, and sunk or damaged 24 vessels, with nearly 60,000 tons of shipping sunk. The material losses of her attack were over 25 million in 1918 dollars, and 47 people lost their lives, almost all from either lifeboats overturning, exposure. Very minor ones happened actually from torpedo or gun attacks. But on Black Sunday, you could see that 25% of the vessels sunk in U-151's tour were sunk off New Jersey, and 13 lives were lost. Again, those all had to do with the Carolina and the lifeboat overturning. What's important to note with this is that U-151 did this completely unopposed. At no point during the entire patrol was U-151 ever challenged by an American vessel. When the Germans got back, they thought this was great. Von Knossos observed that a lot of the vessels they sunk were sailing ships, but these were carrying coal. They sent a lot of foodstuffs to the bottom and a lot of merchandise or stuff that would be used in the war. But mainly they realized they were after coal, they were after food. And this has to do with the perception of what the Germans thought was important due to their own situation. In the United States, the US Navy had an obsession with troop ships, that we have to protect harbors, we have to protect troop ships, because those were going to transport the soldiers to Europe, which were going to win the war for us. Not a lot was done to protect commercial shipping, fishing vessels, and that's exactly what the Germans were going after. But one of the funny things is when the Germans came over and they were stopping these vessels, they kept asking the captains, "Where are the minefields? We need maps of the minefields. Where are the defenses? Where are the nets?" And the sad thing is that there weren't any. They thought the fishermen were playing dumb, but there really weren't any. And the reason behind this is that American industry was so productive that so many ships were being built, so many goods were being sent over that they thought if they put up minefields, that they would actually sink more vessels and slow down all the shipments making its way to Europe. So the Germans encountered almost none of this. And this brings us to how Americans did react, which were a little bit extreme besides the US Navy. So in New York, the police commissioner enforced blackouts, not out of fear of U-boats seeing the silhouette of ships on a backlit horizon, but they were afraid that U-boats were actually going to launch planes, that Zeppelins were going to come over, or that surface vessels were going to come and bombard the city. It was a good idea, not for the reasons that he had, but it was a good idea. Unfortunately, William Sims, after the war, basically in his published memoir Victory at Sea, called the commissioner an idiot, said it was stupid, and we paid for it in World War II. Commercial shipping was quicker to react than the Navy. They demanded ports be closed. Marine insurance skyrocketed if any vessels were insured at all. And because there are so many transmissions saying that there was no submarine, no war warning, now with all the sinkings, they thought all of them were over here. They thought there were at least 5 operating, They thought that these were coming from secret bases in Mexico and the Caribbean, and South America, again, which had large German populations. And the New York Times actually reported that eyewitnesses spotted submarines being built in warehouses within New York City, in sections. In Long Branch, patrols started arresting people that they thought were acting suspicious, walking along the water. They thought that they were signaling vessels. And even on the Carolina, a Hungarian aristocracy through descent. He lived in Long Island, Von Jenny. He was on board the Carolina when he was coming back, and they claim that he was actually somehow radioing submarines to come attack them, and this was not the case. He lost a lot of money when that went down, and he lamented to newspapers, his silly German last name is getting him in trouble through when the war started, but it had nothing to do with that. This is something I just made to illustrate what vessels silhouetted against a backlit horizon will look like. I hope you can see it. It was a pretty poor clip art thing I did. But this is what the Germans actually counted on during World War II when they came. And this is another thing that exists in New Jersey. I grew up in Seawarn. That's where this is. This is what's called a McMyler coal dumper. It's still there today. You can't walk up to it like you could when I was a kid because of the warehouses in the area. But in order we actually diverted the entire coal supply through the Northeast for railways and then up the Arthur Kill. So the Germans were sinking so many coal vessels, again, sailing ships, that they moved all the coal to a railway that terminated in Seawarn, where then all these vessels would then take the Arthur Kill up because that would be protected. They knew no submarines were going to go up in the Arthur Kill, and this is pretty much when everything stopped. So it was once again sort of private industry taking the reins and actually being quite effective. I think only one coal vessel was sunk after this point. We're going to get into U-117 right now. I'm going to skip U-156, but before U-117 arrived, U-151 made it back. U-156 came and actually sunk the USS San Diego in the Long Island Sound through a minefield. It then proceeded up to New England. U-140 accompanied U-117 here. And I'm not going to get into all that. It is in my book. I just want to focus specifically on what occurred on Sandy Hook, or what didn't occur off of Sandy Hook that summer. So U-117 departed Kiel on July 11th. Unlike the other submarines, U-117 did so undetected. The Royal Navy was so good at intercepting German radio signals and deciphering the room 40 that they basically knew when all the submarines left. They did it with U-117. They didn't find out until it was already along the way. But U-117 came here to distribute mines along the East Coast, which initially included the New York Harbor, the shipping lanes off of Long Beach Island, around Barnegat, sink any targets of opportunity. There were 42 mines kept on board and 20 torpedoes. To the right is what one of the mines would have looked like. The posts you see there are the frame. This would drop out of the submarine while it was submerged, and then act as an anchor, and then a chain would raise the mine and arm it. And U-117 arrived here on August 12th, a month after the San Diego got here. Here we have a picture of the crew, another picture on the voyage over here on what conditions were like in the Atlantic. When U-117 got here in August and entered the shipping lanes off of Fire Island, again Long Island, conditions were extremely foggy. The U-117 had to submerge just to avoid hitting other vessels. They heard a lot of foghorns. They could eventually see lights, but there was so much traffic that they just had to submerge to get out of the way to keep themselves from being sunk via collision. The one target which stood out to them was the Sommerstad, which you see to the right, a Norwegian vessel. And this was actually sunk without warning. This had a deck gun mounted to the stern. And anytime the Germans saw that, even in the United States, they usually fired first and asked questions later. Interesting about this is that newspapers reported that the survivors claimed that the Germans were using radio-controlled torpedoes to hit targets, because they claim that the torpedo actually went in front of their ship and then turned around and hit it. I know a diving team that actually went to this wreck, and I was trying to get them to confirm that story, that they could at least tell me what part of the ship it hit, but they said it was too far gone and they couldn't tell me. But I am curious about it because the Germans didn't have this. They had no intention of doing this. Up to that time, the U.S. Navy did offset they set the gyroscope on torpedoes when they were training to make a U, so that after they fired the torpedo, which were duds when they were training, it would circle back to them and then they could retrieve it and reuse it. This was not something the Germans ever did. In fact, the chief engineer for U-117 said that he hated using torpedoes because if they broke and they circled back, that they were in danger of using it. He preferred deck gun battles, which most of the commanders did. But this was sunk with a torpedo, and this sort of set off a chain reaction of a lot of things. Before we get into that, we'll get into Fort Hancock. U-117 would have seen this. U-117 actually marked Sandy Hook on the charts that it had for the mine charts, to note the mining locations. U-117 was the only U-boat that came here that specifically marked down Sandy Hook on the map. And I believe Fort Hancock is the reason behind that. Although it was stripped of most of its cannons, it still had 6-inch guns, which is basically what U-151, U-139, and U-117 had. So they were just as formidable. They actually could shoot further. And they were regularly firing exercises. I don't know if Captain Otto Drescher, he was the commander of U-117, heard it, but based on what happened, I believe that he probably did actually hear firing exercises from Fort Hancock and knew that, man, maybe I shouldn't actually go into the New York Harbor and lay down minefields, because there's a major fort there. And it wasn't just Fort Hancock in Brooklyn. There was also another one. There were a few for the coastal defense. But he didn't enter New York Harbor a lot because of Fort Hancock. When the Somerset was actually sunk, you didn't hear Fort Hancock, but the next day, the Asbury Park Press reported that there were bursts of firing between 3 and 6 shots, repeated at intervals between 10 and 15 minutes, between 3 and 4 p.m. At the time the Asbury Park said this, it was just a note. They said that locals weren't concerned because this always happened at Fort Hancock. They thought it was the proving ground. They thought it was they thought it was drills. Nothing to be concerned about at this point. And this is one of those 6-inch guns. This is at Battery Gunnison, which I took this picture. It wasn't located there at the time. It was located at Battery Peck. And you can see in the back, actually, a container ship, which would be about 3 or 4 times bigger than U-117 was. But it would have been very clear to them if U-117 actually got to Sandy Hook. And although it's difficult to see with this is where he marked Sandy Hook. The hook would actually be right there, and that's Otto Drescher's handwriting. So after they sunk the Somerset, again, conditions were really bad. They turned south to go to Barnegat Inlet instead of going to New York Harbor. Again, they were supposed to go to New York Harbor. They opted not to. Before they did so, they actually submerged to the seabed so that the crew could rest. They surfaced on the morning of the 13th and then started heading on the surface to Long Beach Island. They didn't see any sub chasers, and actually saw very few traffic until they got to Barnegat. But back in Long Island, in the area that they sunk the Somerset, there was a flurry of activity. So at 6 in the morning, so again, this is the next day, the next morning after the Somerset was sunk, but with U-117 nowhere near there, at 0600, this British steamer Pyrrhus claimed that it was being attacked by a submarine and actually fought with this Phantom submarine for 2 hours. They fired 75 shells. They launched depth charges. They claimed that these actually disrupted 2 torpedoes that were sunk, and they were radioing like crazy for anybody to help them. What this did was notify the 3rd Naval District in New York to send all of their sub-chasers, the remaining destroyers they had, to respond to the Pyrrhus off Long Island. There was nobody there at the time. Now, the 3rd Naval District was responsible for New York, all the way down to Brielle, just about. At which point the 4th Naval District, which was based out of Philadelphia, would have taken over. But because this was the only report that day going on, the 4th Naval District never sent out their sub-chasers respond, and all resources were sent to the Pyrrhus, which left the New Jersey coast completely undefended. And this was the result. This is a dazzled camouflage tanker. It's called the Frederick R. Kellogg. It's not sunk here. The water was so shallow here that it actually hit the seabed and looked just like this, and was later salvaged. But unfortunately, people did die. So when U-117 was heading toward Barnegat, they were prepared to lay a minefield. They really didn't want to attack any surface vessels, and actually ignored a steamship and 2 sailing ships. But then when they saw this tanker, they figured this is something that can't be ignored. They saw it was dazzle camouflage, which is those lines you see. Sometimes it was checkerboard patterns. It was meant to disrupt, basically make sure that U-boats couldn't accurately track their distance, their speed, or their track. And U-117 Captain Lloyd Drusher said that he also saw a deck gun on it, and they torpedoed it without any warning at 5:10, and it sank in less than 5 minutes with 7 men killed, most of which were in the engine room, but 2 naval reservists in their bunk. They had just eaten dinner. Chester Cubberley is to the right. He is one of us. He was a native of Long Branch, and he left behind his mother, who he regularly corresponded with, along with Rutgers College, which is now Rutgers University. The survivors that did make it actually made it their way to Sandy Hook that evening, but U-117 was already gone. After it sunk the Frederick R. Kellogg, it laid a minefield off the Delaware Bay and actually got in trouble in the Delaware Bay. But that's another story. We could talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. Now, after the war, so this is now in the end of November, I believe, or early December. The Asbury Park Press published an article. I'm sorry, November 18th. I wrote it right there. That the gun noises that it heard, that are reported over the summer, that are reported as being routine drills, were now actually being told by confidential advisors that U-117 came within Sandy Hook near the Coast Guard station and began shelling it. And that the noises they heard from Sandy Hook were retaliatory shots. This is, for some reason, this is still going on. I guess it's when you have a choice between printing legends and facts, it's better to print the legends, because you can see over here on December 29th of 2018, 100 years later, it's still being republished. They revisited this article, but sort of came to the same conclusions. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. We know it didn't. The first records that I got in researching my book were U-117s, and the first page I turned to was that August to see exactly where U-117 was when Sandy Hook claimed they were being shelled, and nowhere near it. What did happen on Sandy Hook, though, throughout the war, was that there were a lot of close calls from friendly fire within Fort Hancock and the proving grounds. An officer was nearly decapitated. Shells were going through tents. One nearly killed a soldier, and actually a few fell by the guard gate, which still exists. As I was quite a bit a ways. And even out in New York, in the New York batteries, you had soldiers getting shot at with Springfield 1903 rifles, with guys playing around. There were injuries reported. There weren't any casualties. But it seems to me that with all this going on, this U-117 was an easy scapegoat for a lot of bad things that happened within Sandy Hook. They could say, oh, well, yeah, all those craters in the ground, that's from U-117. It's not from our guns misfiring. Now, this is a report from the Army, which says that several shells, some as big as 10 inches, impacted at various points on the Fort Hancock Reservation. Barracks and other structures occupied by the troops had been endangered. Colonel Brady, who had replaced Colonel Harris as the commander of Sandy Hook defenses, called these incidents to the attention of his superiors. When asked for an explanation, Colonel William A. Phillips of the Proving Ground reported that his people took every reasonable precaution but Fort Hancock is in dangerous proximity to the proof battery. Premature explosions or other accidents were impossible to foresee or control. And after the war, they could say it was U-117 that did it, and I firmly believe that that's actually what happened. More embarrassing than everything that happened at Sandy Hook were that of the 7 U-boats that were actually sent to the United States, 5 of them that actually reached here sunk 92 vessels and sunk nearly 175,000 tons of shipping, including killing 133 including killing 133 people. And they did so almost completely unopposed. This is if you take anything from history, it should be this, because this really proves that as Bismarck said, the only thing we learn from history is that no one learns from history. Because this should have been a wake up call, and it wasn't. The Germans basically adopted the same strategy during World War II, and in the hubris of winning World War I, the United States failed to adopt any further coastal defense or really develop any practices to improve on defense or shipping across the Atlantic, and we'll talk about that right now. Because William Sims, again, he's in charge of the US Navy and European forces, a really big Anglophile. He just discounted the entire campaign off of North America as one of the minor incidents of the war. He claimed that the U cruisers and the U-117 mine layers were the least harmful of any of the German U-boat types, and that they sunk vessels of no great military importance. Yes and no. They did sink some troop ships that were empty. They got them when they were coming back from France. And U-152, which didn't make it to the United States, but did make it about halfway across the Atlantic, sunk the USS Ticonderoga in a gunfight on the surface, and killed over 200 sailors and some army personnel that were headed to Europe. So the attacks weren't victimless. And if we look back, 175,000 tons is a lot of shipping, and 133 is quite a bit too, if you take into account that for the most part, the Germans were allowing people to get off the vessels. They were trying to preserve life. Yes, some were sunk, like the Frederick R. Kellogg, without warning. Some were sunk by the minefields that were laid. But for the most part, people were given opportunities to get off, and either through exposure to the elements because it took them so long to reach shore, or storms, or overturning. That's how many still died. Now, in 1942, when the Germans came back, they called this was the first part of Operation Paukenschlag. They called it the Happy Times. The Germans sunk 151,000 tons of shipping in 2 months. Quite a bit more deaths, but they were sinking vessels without any warning, and they were using torpedoes. This actually prompted an immediate response from the Navy, and they considered it a tragedy. His historian Mike McGann says that it was America's second Pearl Harbor. So we left World War I with just about the same, if not more, damage done, and a real lesson on how the Germans may do stuff in the future. We did nothing. We sort of accepted it and figured, oh, this was useless. They got nothing done, and then suffered the same things. Eventually, we did fix it, but we had to suffer first. And the picture that I showed beforehand of the silhouetted target, that was a major problem during World War II. New York did actually darken their lights, but in New Jersey, Atlantic City, a lot of the shore towns, they did dampen to some degree, but they were actually afraid of doing blackouts because they were afraid of losing tourism. So they were still backlit silhouettes, and there's stories in newspapers about tourists going down there, and on one night they're having a great time. In the morning they wake up and there's oil on the beaches from sunken vessels right off the water. A large part because we didn't blacken those the skylines. And so I did just about keep it under an hour. That was my goal because I'm really into this topic and can go on forever. So if we have any questions or comments, let me know and we could talk about it at length.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
You did. You kept it at under an hour. That's good. Not totally necessary, but it works. Can you see the chat, or is it just coming to me?
If I expand Zoom,
Let's see. I don't know.
I have the chat open now. Yep.
Okay. I love the research that you did on U-117. That was great, separating sort of the fact from fiction on that one. That's coming from the John Barrow School of history, separating fact from fiction. He's really good at that.
The you know, I was on a podcast recently, and that's what bothers me about a lot of this. There's so much history, things that seem obvious that just haven't been researched, and this is one of them. My research was the first in almost a century that actually used German sources. The U.S. Navy published a book. There was another book when the U-boats came to America that was published here. There's Raiders of the Deep, which Lowell Thomas wrote. He interviewed Friedrich Korner of U-151, but nobody actually bothered to check any German sources, and it tells a much different story than what's presented here. Um, and I know with academia now, they sort of push you to find niche topics, to find things that are sort of haven't been explored. But there's quite a bit that, you think there's famous things, and you scratch the surface just a little bit and you realize there hasn't really been a lot written. And you don't have to have a doctorate in history to do it. The National Archives here are free to American citizens. You just have to go and do a little bit of the work, and you'd be surprised at what you found. I'm over halfway done with a second book now, and I have just over 100 pages, if you format it into book size, written on an event that was covered at most with 13 pages. And again, it's just from people not. I don't know if it's because if it's the language barrier, but in the 21st century, that's a bad excuse because we
Sure,
can
with
have
Google
computers translate it
Translate.
for us. Yeah,
Did you have to use that at all? Google Translate?
no.
Okay.
My reading and writing German skills are pretty good. Um, and especially when you're reading naval deck logs, it's written like a 5-year-old really would have written it, so it was easy. I can speak German poorly. I could read it and write it very well, so that wasn't a problem.
That's cool. Yeah, when you ask one question, it just leads to 10 more questions in research, right?
Yeah, it really does. It's a bottomless pit.
It's like a life of its own. Okay, I see it, chat. Okay, he's saying, in my research for my master's in history, I focused on Black Tom Island and how Fort Hancock was important to the defense of the harbor. I loved your presentation. Okay, so that was a compliment, it wasn't a question.
He brought up Black Tom Island, which I had in my slide. I didn't want to talk about it because we could talk forever specifically about that. But there were Germans here before World War One, before the United States entered World War One. And that goes sort of with the question before that about the purists that I'll get into in a second. But even before the war, we had Germans in New York. Captain von Rintelen, I have his memoirs. Somebody else wrote a book about him also. He was a naval officer. He came here and he developed pencil bombs with a scientist. Well, a scientist actually came to him, which were lead tubes with a copper washer, and the thickness of the washer would determine when the two chemicals on the pipe mixed. Was an acid, and it would burn through the copper and then blow up. So they were putting these on ships. He was responsible with the explosion at Black Tom Island, and this leads into that other question about the Pierce, in that there was a bit of hysteria, especially after U-151 came here, because once U-151 sunk so many vessels off New Jersey and the East Coast in general, everybody now saw submarines everywhere. So in between when U-151 left and U-156 came, you had vessels running aground because they were too afraid to go into the ocean. You had warships firing into the ocean because they thought they saw submarines. You saw wreckage floating that they thought were periscopes and people shooting at that. So the Pyrrhus, yes, it definitely wasn't a submarine. There's no Germans that were there. They may have seen debris, but they thought it was a periscope. They thought it was, part of the deck sticking out, and that's what they were firing. And it wasn't just the Pyrrhus that did it. The Felix Taussig sunk a subchaser. There was a lot of friendly fire, and that's something else William Sims didn't really talk about, is all the American lives lost through our own attacks. And we did have submarines during the war, and we sort of had to pull these back because everybody just thought they were German submarines, and they weren't.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a scary environment, plus
Sure.
add scary environment to paranoia and the need to be ready instantly or you die. I could see where people would have a hair trigger. It's terrible. Nancy's asking if any minefields still exist off New Jersey or were they all destroyed?
They were all destroyed, at least during World War One. If there's any still from World War Two, I can't imagine them actually working. This was also a bit delayed. So U-117 left mines in August in busy shipping lanes. So Barnegat, even today, about 12 miles off, is still a very large shipping lane. And even though U-117 left a lot of mines, they didn't actually sink anything until October. And they did a lot of damage there, including damaging the USS Minnesota to the fact that they took it out of the war. They didn't kill anybody, but the USS Minnesota battleship had to go back and be refitted. Some people did die when their ships went down because the mines were so powerful they sunk vessels within minutes. A lot of these, so after Germany, after the armistice, Germany, as one of the conditions, had to tell the United States and Britain where the mines were, and they did. And a lot of these mines weren't even discovered or disabled until January or February. So that's many months after. And most of these mines didn't sink anything immediately. It took a month or so for them to actually hit it. But they were all destroyed. A lot of the ones, the chains broke and the mines floated to the surface, so it made it a little bit easier. But yes, there's none that left from World War One.
Okay. So Nancy, it's safe to go in the water. You're fine. Okay, Stephen is asking, for the US war efforts, was the German submarine program more of an embarrassment of our lack of defenses or a propaganda tool to overwhelm pressure on the bloodthirsty Huns to win the war? Wow, okay, so that's a long one. I don't know if you could read that.
I'm just trying to think of what the question is. So were the
Yeah.
U.S. war efforts an embarrassment of or lack of defense? All right, I think I understand. So I'll answer the first part or the last part first.
Was it a
I don't feel
propaganda?
that the Germans were ever overwhelmed with pressure. Um, there were still submarines coming to the United States when the war ended. Um, the Germans didn't think that they were doing anything bad. They thought they were actually winning the war with the with at least the North American campaign over here. Every time the U-boats made it back to Germany before the war ended, they were being commended on successful patrols. The superiors were saying, you've done exactly what we set out for you to do. You sunk the vessels that we wanted you to sink. And their strategy was, this is working. They underestimated how many Americans were actually making it across to Europe. But the U.S. Navy, again, was obsessed with troop ships. And that was not what the Germans were going after. They were going after the food supplies and the coal supplies. I I wouldn't say that U.S. war efforts were an embarrassment. I would say that strategy was misguided, but a lot of it has to do with the infancy of the warfare.
Mhm.
We never had to fight submarines before. Before World War One started, even naval defense plans, War Plan Black, which was what to do in case we entered war with Germany, focused on the Caribbean. And naval policy was basically to let the Germans come to the Caribbean if they wanted to extend their colonial empire. This way, they would overrun their supply lines, and then we would send the bulk of our forces down and destroy them. When sub chasers and destroyers did go to fight submarines, it was a more reactive strategy than an offensive one. We had a lot of sub chasers, enough that could have been doing aggressive patrols to warn about U-boats, but that's not the way they were sent out. They were sent in what were called hunter squadrons, which were groups of destroyers and sub chasers that when something happened, they then responded to it. Now, U-117 was actually almost sunk by sub chasers in the Delaware Bay. The reason they gave up on the attack was because these submarines were constructed so shoddily that U-117 was leaking tons of fuel and a compressed air line burst, which was making bubbles go to the surface. So after the depth charges were dropped, although U-117 was okay, they saw the fuel, they saw the bubbles, they said, oh wow, we sunk this. U-140 was also really nearly sunk by a destroyer, the USS Stringham. But again, it saw a major oil leak and thought it was actually sunk and gave up. Um, so I wouldn't call it an embarrassment. I think the embarrassment is not learning from the mistakes of World War One. So that when World War Two came, we didn't have anything in place and had to reestablish convoys again, had to redevelop basically a strategy of defending the coast all from scratch again.
Mhm.
Um, I hope that answers the question. I know it's sort of long-winded.
No, I think you did a great job. Bernice has a great question. How were the subs refueled?
Okay, that is a good question, and
Mhm.
that's one gotten a lot. And the answer is that they weren't.
Oh,
Um,
okay. I thought you were gonna say they come up to the top, they come out of the little hole, they fill up the gas tank, they go back to.
well, an interesting story about that too. So the slide I showed way in the beginning, which showed a U cruiser next to the two small coastal submarines. There's a huge size disparity. These were built. The U cruisers, like U-151, the converted merchants, were supposed to do about 20,000 miles. Um, I'm sorry, they did about 25,000. U-139, U-140 were supposed to do 20,000. They got around 19,000. U-117 was a little bit less. I think off the top of my head, around 12,000 under ideal conditions. So they could make it over here, operate for about 2 weeks, and then go back.
Wow.
It was never the intention to refuel. But like I was just saying, U-140 and U-117 leaked terribly. Um, from the time they left port, they saw an oil sheen trailing them. So they were just leaking out fuel to the point that U-117 ran out on the way back home and called U-140 and said, hey, I need some help. Can we meet up and can I take some of your fuel? And they did. They had hermetically sealed containers about 18 inches. If you've ever been inside um, Battery Gunnison at Sandy Hook, they do tours every once in a while there. But they have these hermetically sealed cases for the shells. The Germans had the same thing. It looked exactly the same, and they strung a line between the submarines and filled those with diesel and then put them into the oil tanks.
Wow.
Although it's not in U-117's log, the memoirs of the chief engineer indicate that they may have actually taken diesel from another vessel they sunk also. But that wasn't the plan. It was just because they were so poorly constructed that they were way off the curve, their travel curve.
Wow. It's amazing. Anne Marie is asking if we know why none of Edison's inventions were purchased by the military.
That would be a better question for John Barrows. He's done more research in it than I sort of touched on the subject. I don't even really write about it in the book because none of it was really accepted. Um,
Do we
people,
know if John has something on his website?
yeah, it's on his website.
Okay, guys, it's a Monmouth. Oh, gee, I think it's Monmouth Timeline dot. Let me just look it up for you. Monmouth Timeline.org. I should know this. I use it all the time. Monmouth Timeline. Let's see. Monmouthtimeline.org. And John Barrows has a lot of fantastic
Yeah,
stories.
it's
Excellent
really
research.
excellent.
Yeah.
But they say some people say because he wasn't in the naval circles already, they favored contractors that they knew already, and again, a lot of it was from a 21st century perspective. It's hard to argue why things weren't accepted. But if you have to look back in time, and some of these ideas may have been thought of as too revolutionary, too controversial, too wacky. Hydrophones, he invented a type of hydrophone. There were still already some in place already. Like I said, the subchasers used three different ones, which had to were used to sort of triangulate where a U-boat was, but they had to stop to do so. Um, this happened in the Delaware Bay, and U-170 didn't know what was going on, but they were actually in place. So
Okay.
I again go to Monmouth Timeline. John did a much better job explaining that than I could possibly do today.
Okay. And it's also just a fun website to, you just learn a million things. Thank you so much for tonight. This was fantastic. I'm gonna, for those of you who have more questions, so his information is up on the screen. You can email Dominic. You can go to his website and check it out, and certainly buy the book. It's one of the best World War I books of all time, apparently.
That was a little flaky, but I'll take it. I'll take that award.
Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next month for Gary Soretsky's lecture on, I think it's October 10th. Check our website. Thank
All right, thank you
you.
very much for having me.
Bye.